And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, marine forecasts here for Wednesday. Small craft advisories here on the south coast for southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. East-southeast at about 30 knots on the central coast and 25 to 35 knot winds right out of the east for the north coast. And for the central northern interchannel, southeasterlies at about 10, but Clarence Strait, southeast at 20 knots. No change for Clarence Strait on Thursday there, southeast at 20. A little bit of a pickup in the winds here for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal, southeast at 15 to 20 knots. South coast, small craft advisories, south at 30 knots, seas 10 to 13 feet. And the north coast here, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, east winds 30 knots with seas at 7 feet. Eastern North Gulf Coast, east to southeast at 30, southeast 25. For the western North Gulf Coast, Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, small craft advisories, southeast at 30. And for Cook Inlet, east and northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Cook Inlet on Thursday, south winds 20 knots. Same forecast for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. North Gulf Coast, not much different. South winds 20 to 25 knots there, and Prince William Sound southerlies at 20 knots. Kodiak Island, south winds 20 to 25 knots for the day Wednesday. Small craft advisories for the peninsula out here for south to southwest winds 25 to 30. Bristol Bay, south at 25. And for the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday, south to southwest winds down to 15 knots now, and south at 15 for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, mostly south winds at around 20 knots. And for the eastern and central Aleutians tomorrow, southwest winds 25 knots here from Adak Island all the way to Unalaska. And for the western Aleutians, north winds 30 to maybe 35 knots. And then for Thursday, west-northwest winds 25 to 30 knots here, western Aleutians, Adak and Atka. And the eastern Aleutians looking at northwest winds at 25 to 30 knots with seas running 9 to 17 feet. And for the southwest coast, small craft advisories for the Kuskokwim Delta coast here, southeast at 30 knots, northeast 25, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, 30 knot northeast winds for Norton Sound. And for the central Bering Sea out here, north at 40 there for St. Matthew Island, turning northwest and diminishing to 20 knots across the Pribilofs. And for the Pribilof Islands on Thursday, northwest winds 25 knots, north at 35 for St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island there, northeast at 15 to 20 knots, north winds 15 knots to the Yukon Delta coast, and then south 20 knots here, south of Nunivak Island. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east 40 knots there, supporting that blizzard warning for that same area. And then brisk wind advisories for the central coast, east at 25, and the Chukchi Sea, north winds 25 to 35 knots. And that pretty much holds for the Chukchi Sea on Thursday. North winds 25 to 35 knots, north at 15 for the western Arctic coast, central coast, east winds at 20 knots, and east winds 25 to 40 knots, actually 45 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.